A single monarch declared himself master of all Britain. 5 separate armies assembled to demonstrate the fatal flaw in his ambition. Upon a field drenched in the blood of warriors, a field whose very name would resonate through countless generations, the future of England itself teetered on the edge of oblivion. The autumn fog embraced the northern highlands like a funeral pall, clinging to every valley and hilltop. The year stood at 937, and somewhere across a portion of terrain whose precise designation has vanished into the mists of antiquity, though warriors and chroniclers would come to know it as Brunanburh, 2 massive military forces prepared themselves in the dim illumination that precedes sunrise. On one flank, arrayed beneath standards displaying the golden dragon of Wessex, stood the forces of England. 20,000 fighting men, perhaps considerably more, summoned from every territory and region of a realm that had never before existed as a unified entity. Their sovereign was youthful, scarcely 40 winters old, yet his reputation already carried such weight that it caused distant monarchs to wake trembling in the darkness. Aethelstan, King of the English, Lord of Britain, direct descendant of Alfred the Great, the man who had transformed a dream into iron reality. On the opposing side of that fateful field, the banners revealed an entirely different narrative. The raven standard of the Norsemen, the lion emblem of Scotland, the time-honored symbols of Strathclyde. This was no singular military force, but rather a confederation born of mutual grievance and shared hatred. Vikings who had sailed from Dublin, Scots who had marched down from Alba, Britons from the ancient Celtic kingdoms of the northern reaches. They had forged an alliance with one absolute purpose: to obliterate English dominance before it devoured them all. Their numbers rivaled Aethelstan's forces, possibly surpassed them. Their rage and determination certainly exceeded anything the English could muster. Between these 2 assembled hosts, the morning light continued its gradual ascent. None among the assembled thousands yet understood the truth, but the events that would unfold across the next dozen hours would ultimately determine whether England would persist as a consolidated kingdom or fragment once more into the warring territories from which it had been so painfully forged through decades of conquest and consolidation. This confrontation represented far more than a territorial dispute or border incursion. This was not some petty dynastic conflict over succession rights. This was the violent collision of 2 incompatible visions for Britain's future, and only one interpretation of that future would survive to see the following dawn. The war drums commenced their ominous rhythm. The sun pierced through the concealing mist, and the day that would give birth to a nation began its inexorable progression toward violence. To comprehend precisely why 5 distinct armies gathered on that fateful autumn morning, you must first understand what Aethelstan had accomplished in his years of rule, and more importantly, why so many powerful men desperately wanted him eliminated from the political landscape. For countless generations, the island the Roman conquerors had designated Britannia had existed as a fractured mosaic of perpetually warring kingdoms, each jealously guarding its territory and constantly seeking advantage over its neighbors. The Anglo-Saxons maintained control over the southern and eastern regions, Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, Northumbria, each kingdom distinct and often hostile to the others. Vikings of Danish and Norwegian origin controlled vast territories, known collectively as the Danelaw, while maintaining a powerful kingdom centered on Dublin across the Irish Sea. The Scots ruled their realm of Alba throughout the Northern Highlands. The Britons, descendants of the original Celtic inhabitants, maintained their grip on Wales and the kingdom of Strathclyde. The Picts held their ancient strongholds in the far north. No single king commanded more than a fragment of the whole island. The very concept of a unified kingdom called England existed only as an impossible dream at best, or, as most practical men saw it, a dangerous delusion that could only lead to disaster and overreach. Then came Aethelstan, born during the 890s into a world of perpetual warfare and uncertain borders. He emerged as the son of Edward the Elder and grandson of Alfred the Great, the legendary monarch who had rescued Wessex from total annihilation at Viking hands and transformed it into the most formidable Saxon kingdom in Britain. But both Alfred and Edward had been satisfied to rule their respective territories and defend their established borders against encroachment. They had been content with survival and stability. Aethelstan desired something far more ambitious. He wanted to achieve what no man had accomplished in 4 centuries of chaos and fragmentation. He wanted every inch of England united beneath a single crown, his crown. And through divine providence and iron determination, he succeeded in taking it. When he secured his throne in the year 924, Aethelstan moved with a velocity and ruthless efficiency that left his enemies stunned and scrambling to respond. He absorbed the kingdom of Mercia through a combination of political maneuvering and military pressure. He launched a devastating campaign of conquest against Northumbria, the final remaining Viking kingdom on English soil. He drove the Norse kings back across the Irish Sea, pursuing them relentlessly until they abandoned their English territories entirely. He compelled the Welsh princes to submit to his authority, extracted tribute from them, and established his southern border firmly along the River Wye. By the year 927, Aethelstan had begun styling himself Rex Anglorum, King of the English, and he meant the title with absolute literal precision. For the first time since the Roman legions had departed Britain 5 centuries earlier, one single man ruled all the territory from the English Channel to the Scottish border without significant challenge or opposition. But overwhelming power invariably breeds dangerous enemies, and Aethelstan had created more than his fair share. Every conquest had generated bitter resentment. Every submission ceremony had planted seeds of future rebellion. Every forced treaty had created monarchs who spent their nights plotting revenge. Constantine II of Scotland observed this aggressive English expansion with mounting alarm that bordered on genuine terror. He was an elderly man by this point, weathered and scarred by decades of constant warfare, and he possessed sufficient experience and wisdom to recognize a mortal threat when he saw one positioned directly on his borders. Aethelstan had already forced him into a profoundly humiliating submission ceremony at Ament Bridge, where Constantine had been required to kneel before the English king and acknowledge English overlordship in front of assembled nobles and witnesses who would carry the story of his humiliation back to every corner of Scotland. The Scottish king had knelt. He had spoken the required oaths of submission, but in the privacy of his own great halls, surrounded only by his most trusted counselors, he seethed with impotent rage and plotted revenge. England's reach was extending too far northward. its king growing too ambitious in his territorial claims. If Aethelstan were permitted to consolidate his gains and strengthen his position, Scotland would inevitably be next on his list of conquests, not as a rival kingdom to be negotiated with, but as a province to be absorbed and ruled directly from the English court. Across the turbulent waters of the Irish Sea, another powerful king nursed his own collection of bitter grievances and wounded pride. Olaf Guthfrithson, the young and ambitious king of Dublin, grandson of the legendary Ivar the Boneless, had been forced to watch helplessly as Aethelstan systematically destroyed every Viking kingdom that had existed in Britain for generations. The great Norse stronghold of York had fallen after fierce resistance. The entire Danelaw had submitted to English authority. The Norsemen who had ruled northern England for multiple generations were now scattered as refugees or lying dead in unmarked graves. For Olaf, this represented far more than mere political maneuvering or territorial adjustment. This was a question of cultural survival. If England remained united under a strong king, if the English continued their aggressive expansion, there would soon be no remaining space for Norse rulers anywhere in Britain. The age of Viking kings would reach its inglorious end, crushed beneath English banners and English laws, forgotten by history as just another failed colonial venture. And in the kingdom of Strathclyde, Owen, the king of the Britons, saw his own inevitable future written clearly in the pattern of Aethelstan's previous conquests. The English had already seized control of Northumbria. They dominated Wales through tributary arrangements. Strathclyde now existed as a Celtic island surrounded by an English sea, isolated and vulnerable. If the English king made the strategic decision to complete what he had already begun, there would be nowhere for the Britons to flee, no allies who could offer meaningful assistance. 3 kings, 3 distinct peoples, 3 separate collections of hatred and grievance, but all sharing one common enemy whose growing power threatened their very existence. In the year 937, they reached a momentous decision. They would forge a pact, an alliance of desperation that might have seemed impossible in any other circumstances. Constantine of Scotland would march southward with his full military strength. Grizzled veterans who had survived decades of warfare against Norse raiders and who understood precisely how to maintain a shield wall under the most desperate circumstances. Olaf of Dublin would transport his forces across the Irish Sea, bringing with him hungry young Viking raiders eager to reclaim the territories their fathers and grandfathers had lost to English aggression. Owen of Strathclyde would contribute his Britons to the coalition, warriors who fought with the desperation of men defending their final stronghold. United, their combined forces would substantially outnumber Aethelstan's army. Together, they would launch an invasion of England from the northern frontier, striking deep into English territory before the southern fyrd could be fully mobilized. Together, they would destroy the English king and partition his realm among themselves like butchers dividing a carcass, returning Britain to its traditional fragmented state. This represented the most formidable military coalition ever assembled against England in its brief history as a unified entity. If this alliance succeeded in its objectives, Aethelstan's unified kingdom would perish with him, and England would dissolve back into competing territories. If the coalition failed, there would be no remaining force capable of preventing England's continued rise to dominance over all of Britain. Aethelstan received definitive intelligence regarding the impending invasion during the summer months of 937. His network of informants and scouts brought word that the coalition was assembling in the far north, near the Scottish border, gathering their forces and preparing provisions for a sustained campaign deep into English territory. Their strategic intentions were abundantly clear to any experienced military commander. They planned to strike swiftly and deeply into Aethelstan's heartland before he could fully mobilize his dispersed forces, burn villages and farms, plunder what supplies they needed, and force him into a decisive battle where their superior numbers would determine the outcome. The English king did not hesitate or convene lengthy councils to debate potential responses. He immediately called his banners, summoning every earl and thegn who owed him military service. From the southern reaches of Wessex, from the Mercian heartlands, from East Anglia's marshes, from the recently conquered territories of Northumbria, the warriors assembled. Lords and thanes, professional huscarls, and common ferdmen called from their fields and workshops. Men who spoke noticeably different dialects and who had fought against each other within living memory, but who now served under one king and marched beneath one banner. Aethelstan had devoted 13 exhausting years to forging England from disparate kingdoms. He would not passively observe as foreign armies tore his creation apart without exacting a terrible price in blood first. He marched northward with his younger brother Edmund riding at his side, a young man barely 20 summers old, but already a tested warrior in multiple campaigns and Aethelstan's designated heir. They advanced rapidly, gathering additional strength as they progressed northward, absolutely determined to intercept the coalition army before it could devastate the Midlands and threaten the English heartland. Somewhere in the northern territories, inevitably, the two massive armies made contact. The precise geographical location has been vigorously debated by historians and antiquarians for more than a millennium. Bromborough on the Wirral Peninsula, the marshy banks of the Humber, the desolate moors of Northumbria, all have been proposed and argued over. But the name that survived in poetry and chronicle was Brunanburh, likely a field or valley, perhaps a river ford, a location whose exact geography ultimately mattered far less than the momentous events that transpired there. By late summer or early autumn of 937, both enormous armies had maneuvered into position within sight of each other. The coalition commanders, supremely confident in their numerical superiority and the righteousness of their cause, prepared their forces to sweep the English from the field in a single devastating assault. Aethelstan, fully aware that everything he had constructed over 13 years of constant warfare could be utterly destroyed in the next 12 hours, carefully prepared his warriors to hold their ground regardless of the cost. Neither side possessed any interest in negotiated peace or diplomatic compromise. Neither side believed that any middle ground existed. This would be a fight to the absolute finish, and the defeated army would not survive to write their version of history. The coalition forces arrived at the chosen battlefield first, giving them the invaluable advantage of selecting their ground carefully. Constantine, Olaf, and Owen surveyed the terrain meticulously, searching for a position that would permit their numerically superior forces to deploy their full strength, where the English could not utilize narrow terrain features to negate the coalition's advantage in raw numbers. They identified what appeared to be ideal ground, an expansive stretch of open moorland sufficiently wide to accommodate many thousands of warriors forming parallel battle lines, with gentle slopes that would allow their fighters to maintain clear sight lines to the enemy as they advanced to contact. For the Scots and Strathclyde Britons, this represented familiar territory, northern country, cool and perpetually damp, even during late summer months, where the prevailing wind carried the distinctive scents of heather and peat across the landscape. For Olaf's Dublin Vikings, the terrain was less familiar, but they cared nothing for such details. They had crossed the Irish Sea seeking vengeance and the restoration of lost territories, and they would have their reckoning on whatever ground England offered. The coalition commanders held extensive council on the night preceding battle, gathering in one of the great pavilions erected for the occasion. Constantine, as the eldest present and possessing the most extensive military experience, argued persuasively for patience and defensive posture. He recommended allowing the English to advance against them, permitting Æthelstan's warriors to exhaust themselves climbing the gentle slope while under missile fire. Olaf, considerably younger and naturally more aggressive in temperament, advocated for an immediate dawn attack, urging the use of their numerical superiority to overwhelm the English shield wall before it could properly form and solidify into an impenetrable barrier. Owen, positioned uncomfortably between these two contrasting strategic visions, urged unity above all other considerations. They had come this far together despite ancient enmities and cultural differences. They could not afford to splinter into factions now, when victory seemed within reach. After hours of debate and negotiation, they finally agreed upon a relatively straightforward battle plan. They would form a massive, extended battle line that would fully utilize their numerical advantage. They would allow Æthelstan's army to exhaust itself in the initial brutal clash, then systematically use their superior numbers to envelop the English flanks and surround them completely. The plan possessed little subtlety or tactical sophistication, but as the coalition commanders recognized, it did not require complexity. They possessed more warriors, more weapons, more accumulated rage. That fundamental advantage should prove sufficient. Across the expanse of moorland, Æthelstan confronted a distinctly different challenge in preparing his forces. His army was unified in name and purpose, but decidedly not unified in blood, culture, or tradition. The warriors of Wessex stood shoulder to shoulder with men of Mercia, who had been mortal enemies barely a generation previously. Northumbrians who had fought desperately against English conquest now stood in the ranks beside the very English soldiers who had conquered them. The ferdmen, farmers and craftsmen called up for military service, stood alongside professional huscarls who had trained for combat since early boyhood. This was supposedly the army of a united England, but this particular army had never been tested together as a unified force. Not like this. Not against a coalition that outnumbered them substantially and wanted nothing more than to tear England back into its constituent fragments. Æthelstan reached his decision quickly, as was his nature when confronted with tactical challenges. He would not attempt to outmaneuver the coalition through clever flanking movements. He would not seek particularly advantageous terrain features or plan elaborate ambushes. He would employ the time-tested strategy that English kings had utilized since Alfred's desperate days: form the shield wall and hold that. The English deployed in a characteristically deep, dense formation designed to maximize defensive strength. The center was deliberately made the strongest point. The king's own household troops, the best armed and most experienced warriors in the entire army. These were men who had fought for Aethelstan through a dozen hard campaigns and who would willingly die for him if circumstances demanded such sacrifice. Edmund, Aethelstan's brother, commanded one wing with trusted thanes under him. Experienced ealdormen commanded the opposite wing. The less experienced ferdmen filled the ranks immediately behind the professional warriors, ready to step forward when the inevitable casualties mounted and the front lines required replacement. Aethelstan personally walked among his assembled warriors on the night before battle was to be joined. He did not deliver grand speeches filled with flowery rhetoric about glory and honor. He recognized that such speeches were unnecessary. These battle-hardened warriors understood perfectly well what they were fighting for. They fought for the kingdom that Aethelstan had painstakingly constructed. They fought for the kingdom their fathers and grandfathers had bled to create from chaos. They fought so that England would not perish before it had truly established itself as a permanent fixture on the political landscape. As darkness finally fell across the moorland, both enormous encampments settled into profoundly uneasy rest. Countless fires flickered across the landscape like scattered stars fallen to earth. Warriors methodically sharpened blades one final time, carefully checked the leather straps securing their shields, and murmured prayers to Christ or to older gods, whose names Christians were not supposed to remember in this enlightened age. Some warriors wrote brief messages for loved ones in case they did not return from the morrow's combat. Others simply sat in absolute silence, staring across the darkness toward the distant fires of the enemy camp, wondering how many of those distant men they would kill when dawn arrived, and pondering how many of those same enemies would kill them. The night stretched endlessly. The wind intensified as midnight approached, carrying with it the smell of approaching rain that never quite materialized. Sentries paced the defensive lines throughout the darkness, watching constantly for any indication of a night assault, but none materialized. Both armies instinctively understood that this confrontation would be settled in full daylight, face to face, shield against shield, with absolutely no tricks or tactical subterfuge, and certainly no mercy for the defeated. As the first gray light of dawn touched the eastern horizon, warriors throughout both camps began to stir from fitful sleep. Commanders bellowed orders in various languages and dialects. Warriors donned their mail shirts and helmets with practiced efficiency, hefted spears and axes, tested sword edges one final time, and slowly formed into their predetermined positions. The coalition forces arrayed themselves across the northern end of the field, a vast, intimidating mass of humanity bristling with thousands of weapons, their various banners snapping loudly in the strengthening wind. The English formed up opposite them, fewer in raw numbers but standing in perfect, unmoving ranks, their shields locked edge to edge, their faces set in grim determination. Between the two armies stretched perhaps 500 yards of empty ground, grass and stones and patches of mud, ground that would soon become utterly unrecognizable. Aethelstan deliberately positioned himself at the absolute center of his battle line, clearly visible in his distinctive royal armor and beneath his personal standard. He wanted his enemies to see him plainly, to understand that the king of the English would not hide safely behind his warriors, but would stand with them, fight alongside them, and if the fates decreed it necessary, die with them. Across the field, Constantine and Olaf observed his prominent position and understood the message perfectly. This would not be a battle where kings remained safely in the rear while common soldiers performed the dying. This confrontation would be intensely personal. The sun climbed higher above the horizon. The wind suddenly dropped to almost nothing. The two armies stood in absolute oppressive silence, thousands upon thousands of warriors staring at each other across the shrinking divide, waiting for the signal that would unleash the storm of violence. Then the horns sounded their harsh calls. The war drums began their rhythmic pounding, and 20,000 warriors on each side lurched forward as one, moving in massive waves, closing the distance with every measured step. The Battle of Brunanburh had finally begun. Part 4. The Clash. The initial collision did not sound like thunder or any natural phenomenon. It was infinitely worse. The indescribable sound of 20,000 warriors smashing violently into 20,000 more. Shields splintering into fragments, iron ringing harshly against iron. Thousands of voices raised in wordless roars that blended together into a single overwhelming wave of noise that drowned rational thought and left only pure instinct. The coalition struck first with devastating force. Olaf's Vikings, deliberately positioned on the coalition's right flank, surged forward with greater velocity than the Scots in the center, eagerly closing with the enemy to do what Vikings had done best for 2 centuries, kill with maximum efficiency. They struck the English left wing like a massive battering ram. Shields thrust forward, battle axes rising and falling in terrible arcs, screaming battle cries in Old Norse that chilled even veteran warriors' blood, despite years of combat experience. The English line buckled under the tremendous impact, but crucially did not break entirely. Mail-clad huscarls locked their shields together and pushed back forcefully, stabbing repeatedly with spears over the shield rims, systematically dragging down Vikings who pushed too far forward beyond their supporting ranks, holding ground because the only alternative was certain death. In the center of the battlefield, the Scots advanced more methodically, their shield wall notably disciplined and tight rather than loose and aggressive. Constantine's warriors were hardened veterans, men who had fought Norse raiders for decades and survived by being consistently smarter, tougher, and more disciplined than their enemies. They did not charge forward wildly like berserkers. They marched forward step by deliberate step, methodically closing the distance with the English center, where Aethelstan himself stood clearly visible beneath his distinctive royal banner. The two shield walls met with a tremendous crash that echoed across the entire moorland. For several long moments, neither side achieved any movement whatsoever. They simply pushed against each other with all their collective strength, shields grinding painfully against shields, men in the front rank gasping desperately for breath in the crushing press of bodies. Unable to step backward, unable to advance forward, locked in a brutal contest of pure strength and endurance that possessed no natural end except total exhaustion or death. Then the systematic killing began in deadly earnest. Spears thrust repeatedly over shield rims, seeking exposed throats and faces. axes hooked viciously over the tops of shields, dragging them downward and exposing vulnerable throats and faces to follow up killing blows. Men in the second and third ranks shoved forward constantly, adding their weight to the push, attempting to drive the enemy backward one painful inch at a time. Those warriors trapped in the front rank died with horrifying speed, crushed by the relentless press of bodies, stabbed by spears they never saw approaching, pulled down into the mass where they were trampled and forgotten within seconds. But behind every man who fell, another warrior stepped forward immediately. The line held through sheer determination. On the English right wing, Edmund's forces clashed violently with Owen's Britons. The youngest of the coalition's leaders had brought warriors who fought with desperate fury. Born from the certain knowledge that if England survived this day intact, their kingdom would inevitably be next to fall to English conquest. They hammered the English right with absolutely relentless attacks, attempting to break through and curl around Ethelstan's vulnerable flank. Edmund, barely 20 years old, but fighting like a warrior possessed by demons, rallied his warriors repeatedly, personally leading countercharges that drove the Britons back temporarily, then retreating into defensive positions when the coalition forces regrouped and surged forward once more. It was brutal, grinding combat with absolutely no elegance or chivalric behavior, just iron and raw courage and the will to hold position for one more minute, then another after that, for as long as breath remained. The battle devolved into an absolute nightmare of deafening noise and total confusion. Men fought in a choking fog of dust and blood, unable to see more than a few feet in any direction, recognizing their comrades only by the colors painted on their shields and the distinctive shapes of their helmets. Shouted commands were utterly impossible to hear over the overwhelming roar of combat. Warriors fought by instinct alone, by years of training, by pure animal survival instinct. When a man fell dead or wounded, his companions did not pause to mourn. They stepped over the body without hesitation and continued fighting because stopping meant dying. Hours passed in this hellish fashion. The sun climbed steadily toward noon. Neither side had achieved a breakthrough. The casualties mounted at a horrifying rate. Hundreds dead initially, then 1,000, then considerably more. But critically, the lines continued to hold. Men who had entered the battle fresh and full of vigor were now gasping desperately for breath, their arms leaden with exhaustion, their shields splintered and barely functional, their mail shirts dented and torn. But they absolutely could not stop fighting. The moment either side showed weakness or wavered, the other would pour through the resulting gap and transform the battle into a one-sided slaughter. Ethelstan fought directly in the center of his line throughout the entire day. He did not attempt to direct the overall battle from a safe distance behind the lines. He stood in the shield wall alongside his household troops, his sword red to the hilt with enemy blood, his voice hoarse from shouting encouragement to the men around him. He personally killed Scots who broke through the front rank. He steadied warriors who began to falter. He made himself constantly visible, deliberately made himself a high-value target, because he understood that if his warriors saw their king bleeding and fighting beside them, they would not break and run. Constantine across the battle line maintained the same approach. The elderly Scottish king was well past 60 years old, an age when most men were content to sit by warm fires and tell stories of battles fought in distant youth. But he stood in the front rank with his warriors throughout the engagement, his sword as steady as it had been 40 years earlier when he was young and strong. He had spent his entire adult life fighting for Scotland's independence from various threats. He would absolutely not flee now when the ultimate test had arrived. For an extended time, it genuinely seemed the battle might never reach any conclusion. Neither army could gain any meaningful advantage. Neither could afford to retreat and concede the field. They were locked together like two mortally wounded beasts, tearing viciously at each other, but unable to deliver the decisive killing blow that would end the contest. Then, as afternoon wore gradually on, the delicate balance finally began to shift decisively. The coalition began to fracture first, not all at once in a single catastrophic collapse, not in one dramatic moment, but slowly, incrementally, like ice gradually melting under sustained pressure, with hairline fractures spreading insidiously through the structure until it could no longer maintain its integrity. On the coalition's right flank, Olaf's Vikings had been fighting with essentially suicidal fury for hours without pause, throwing themselves at the English left in wave after endless wave, attempting to break through by sheer unbridled aggression and willingness to die. But the English line had stubbornly refused to break, despite tremendous pressure. The Vikings had absorbed terrible casualties in their relentless assaults. Jarls and Herseers lay dead in the mud. Their finest warriors were bleeding out in the trampled grass, and they had absolutely nothing to show for their enormous sacrifice. Worse still, the English were not visibly weakening under the sustained pressure. If anything, they appeared to be growing stronger as relatively fresh warriors from the rear ranks systematically rotated forward to replace the exhausted men in the front positions, maintaining consistent pressure. The Vikings began to hesitate perceptibly. Attacks that had been savage and absolutely relentless became tentative, probing. Warriors began glancing over their shoulders with increasing frequency, wondering whether perhaps the moment had arrived to withdraw and regroup for another attempt rather than continue this bloody stalemate. In the center, the Scots were faring no better despite their initial advantages. Constantine's shield wall remained technically intact, but it had been pushed backward step by bloody step, yielding ground it could not afford to lose. The English center, firmly anchored by Ethelstan's household troops, had not yielded a single inch of ground. They fought with a discipline that came only from years of campaigning together as a unified force, systematically rotating exhausted warriors out, bringing fresh fighters forward, maintaining the absolute integrity of the shield wall, even as bodies piled up grotesquely in front of it. The Scots could match them in raw courage, but they simply could not match them in endurance and systematic discipline. And on the coalition's left flank, Owen's Britons were in serious trouble. Edmund had sensed the developing weakness there and had begun pressing harder, committing his carefully husbanded reserves in a series of savage counterattacks that drove the Britons steadily backward and threatened to turn their vulnerable flank entirely. Owen desperately tried to rally his warriors, but they were utterly exhausted, heavily bloodied, and beginning to lose faith that this battle could possibly be won. The coalition had gambled everything on breaking the English in the first brutal hours of combat. They had not broken, and now, as the sun began its visible descent toward the western horizon, the coalition's armies were bleeding at an unsustainable rate, tiring rapidly and starting to seriously wonder whether survival might be more important than victory. Aethelstan saw it all happening. He saw the Vikings begin to hesitate. He saw the Scots waver and give ground. He saw Edmund's wing systematically pushing the Britons backward. He understood instinctively that if he pressed hard with everything he had remaining, the coalition might shatter completely. But if he waited too long, if he allowed them to disengage cleanly and regroup overnight, they would still possess the numerical strength to attempt another assault tomorrow, and his own forces might not survive a second day of this intensity. This had to end now, today, on this field. He raised his bloodied sword high above his head and shouted the command that every English warrior had been desperately waiting to hear. Forward, the English shield wall surged ahead with renewed vigor. Not a cautious advance, not a careful step-by-step push, but a sudden violent charge that caught the coalition forces completely off guard. Warriors who had been locked in essentially static defensive combat for hours suddenly found themselves attacking aggressively, driving forward with purpose, breaking through weak points in the coalition line, transforming the battle from a grinding stalemate into a chaotic melee. The Vikings on the right attempted desperately to hold their position, but Edmund's wing struck them hard from the side at precisely the same moment, catching them between two English forces in a devastating hammer and anvil maneuver. The Viking line disintegrated rapidly. Warriors who had fought with unbreakable courage throughout the entire day suddenly found themselves surrounded, cut off from support, fighting desperately for their individual lives with absolutely no hope of victory. Some died where they stood, refusing to flee. Others began to run. In the center, the Scots felt the pressure intensify dramatically. The English were not just pushing now. They were killing with a methodical, terrifying efficiency that spoke unmistakably of victory within reach. Warriors began falling back, not in an organized tactical retreat, but in an increasingly panicked withdrawal. The shield wall, which had held firm for hours, began to fragment and collapse. Constantine saw his army breaking apart before his eyes and understood with bitter clarity that there was nothing he could do to stop it. He attempted to rally his warriors, tried desperately to form a new defensive line, but the momentum had shifted too far. The English were through the line now, into the coalition's rear areas, systematically cutting down men who had turned to run. The orderly retreat became a disorganized rout. Owen's Britons were the first to break completely and flee the field. Seeing the Scots collapsing and the Vikings fleeing in disorder, they abandoned the battlefield entirely and ran northward, desperate to escape before English cavalry caught them in the open. Many did not succeed. The English pursued with absolute vengeance, cutting down fleeing warriors without mercy, showing no compassion whatsoever to men who had invaded their kingdom. Olaf Guthfrithson, the young Viking king from Dublin, fought his way out of the encirclement with the remnants of his personal bodyguard and fled toward the coast. He had crossed the Irish Sea seeking glory and the reconquest of lost territories. He departed with a small fraction of his army, his dreams utterly shattered, his reputation in complete ruins. Constantine of Scotland, the old warrior king, managed to retreat in somewhat better order, but the defeat was no less complete. He had lost his beloved son in the battle, killed in the final English charge, his body left behind on the field among the thousands of other dead. The Scottish king had risked absolutely everything to stop English expansion. He had failed utterly. His army was broken, his son was dead, and Ethelstan's kingdom still stood strong. The English did not pursue far into the gathering darkness. They were utterly exhausted, heavily bloodied, and possessed no desire to chase a broken enemy into unfamiliar territory in failing light. They had achieved what they needed: victory. As the sun finally set on the field of Brunanburh, the English warriors stood among mountains of dead and gradually realized what they had accomplished. They had faced the greatest coalition ever assembled against England, and they had completely destroyed it. The bodies of thousands of enemies lay scattered across the moorland. Scots, Vikings, Britons, all mingled together in death as they had been in alliance during life. The coalition had come to shatter England. Instead, England had shattered them utterly and completely. Ethelstan walked the battlefield as twilight deepened, moving slowly among the wounded and the dying, checking personally on his own warriors, determining which of his lords and thanes had survived this terrible day. His own losses had been severe. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of his warriors lay dead or dying on the blood-soaked ground, but they had held. When the coalition had thrown everything it possessed at the English line, that line had held firm, and now the existential threat was broken forever. His brother Edmund found him near the center of the field where the fighting had been most intense. The young prince was completely covered in blood, some of it his own from minor wounds, most of it belonging to others. He said nothing. There was nothing that needed to be said. They had survived a battle that could have ended everything their grandfather had built. They had not merely survived. They had won decisively. Around them, English warriors began the grim work of locating their own dead and preparing them for proper burial. The coalition's dead would be left for the carrion birds, a stark message to anyone who might consider challenging England again. The night air filled with the sound of men calling desperately for friends and kinsmen, hoping for an answer, fearing silence. In the darkness, fires were lit across the field, not the campfires of armies preparing for another day of battle, but the funeral pyres of the dead. The English burned or buried their own with what honor they could manage on a field that reeked of blood and death. The coalition's dead lay where they had fallen, scattered across the moorland in grotesque piles, their weapons broken, their banners trampled into the mud. By morning, the coalition survivors were miles away, running desperately for Scotland, for Strathclyde, for ships that would carry them back to Dublin, and the shameful task of explaining to their people how the great invasion had failed so catastrophically. They left behind not just their dead, but their dreams of breaking English power forever. Ethelstan had proven that England could not be divided, not by superior numbers, not by foreign kings, not by anyone. The king of the English stood on that blood-soaked field and understood that something fundamental had changed. His kingdom had been tested as it had never been tested before. His army, drawn from different peoples and different traditions, had fought as one unified force. They had not fought for gold or glory or revenge. They had fought for England, and England had survived. When the sun rose on the day after Brunanburh, it rose on a kingdom that would not fall. The coalition was broken beyond repair. The enemies were scattered and demoralized. The Vikings would never again mount a serious challenge to English rule. The Scots would retreat behind their borders and remain there for generations. The age of England had truly begun, forged in the fire of a single day's battle, paid for in the blood of thousands of men who died believing their cause was just. Aethelstan gave the order to march south. His army, battered and exhausted but victorious, formed their ranks and began the long journey home. They left behind them a field that would be remembered for 1,000 years, not for its precise location, which would be lost to history, but for what happened there, for the battle that proved England could endure, for the day when 5 armies tried to destroy a kingdom, and the kingdom destroyed them instead. The banners moved south, the dead remained, and the field of Brunanburg grew silent, holding its secrets, marked only by the carrion birds circling overhead, and the knowledge that here, in this place, England had been born in fire and blood, and would not die easily. The kingdom that emerged from that field would endure for centuries, its foundations laid by warriors who held the line when everything hung in the balance.